In Formula One, there are accidents that seem impossible to survive. Cars flying through the air, single-seaters ending up flipped over, crashes where the car is completely destroyed, and yet, many times, the driver walks away as if nothing happened. However, the opposite can happen too. Accidents that don't seem so terrifying, but end in the worst possible way. And then there are the accidents that fall right in the middle. The ones that don't end in death, but also aren't just a simple scare. The ones that leave drivers unconscious. Broken bones, burns, skull fractures, comas, and accidents that change lives forever in a matter of seconds. Because in Formula One, surviving doesn't always mean coming out unscathed. That's why today we won't discuss fatal accidents. We're going to talk about brutal injuries, chilling crashes, and drivers who managed to survive but were marked forever. Because in these cases, making it out alive wasn't the end of the story, but just the beginning. These are the 15 most brutal injuries in the history of Formula One. Sergio Perez suffered the most serious injury of his career during the 2011 Monaco Grand Prix. On the Monte Carlo street circuit during qualifying, the Mexican was competing in just his first season in Formula One with Sauber. Perez was on a fast lap when, coming out of the tunnel and reaching the chicane, he slightly brushed the wall, lost control of the car, and this happened. The Sauber crashed head-on into the barriers at high speed. The impact was brutal. After the first hit, the car bounced violently against the barriers and ended up crashing head-on into the inner wall of the chicane. Perez was left stunned in the single-seater and had to be helped by doctors, who took him out on a stretcher before transferring him to the hospital. Later, tests confirmed that he had suffered a concussion and a hematoma in his thigh. Injuries that not only left him out of the Monaco Grand Prix, but also the next race in Canada. Unfortunately, that was not the only major accident that weekend, because the next day, another driver also ended up against the barriers in the Principality. Vitaly Petrov experienced the most worrying moment of his career during the 2011 Monaco Grand Prix. In the final laps of the race, while several cars were fighting for position, there was contact that left Petrov with little room to react. The Renault ended up against the barriers in the middle of the swimming pool section. And although the impact didn't seem that violent, it was serious enough to leave the driver trapped inside the car while the medics arrived at the scene. Petrov was conscious, but for several minutes there was real concern, because after the crash, the Russian driver couldn't feel his legs. Finally, he was removed from the car and taken to the hospital for medical checks. Luckily, the accident didn't end with a permanent injury, but during those minutes, the scene was terrifying. A trapped driver, a stopped race, and the uncertainty of not knowing if he would really be able to walk out. Not all brutal injuries in Formula One happen at over 250 kilometers per hour. Sometimes, danger appears in an area where everything seems to be under control. In the pits. During the 2018 Bahrain Grand Prix, Kimi Raikkonen came into the pits for a stop, but while the team was trying to change the tires, something went terribly wrong. One of the mechanics, Francesco Siggiarini, was still working on the left rear wheel when Raikkonen got the signal to leave. And then this happened. Well, let's see if they're going to start. Hey, they ran over a mechanic. Watch out. The Ferrari started while Siggiarini was still in front of the wheel. The mechanic didn't have time to move away, and the car ended up running directly over his leg. The scene was terrifying. Siggiarini suffered a tibia and fibula fracture and was taken to the hospital for surgery, a brutal injury caused not by a crash, but by a mistake. It all happened in the pits in just 9 seconds. Robert Kubica was involved in one of the most violent accidents in Formula One history during the 2007 Canadian Grand Prix. At the Gilles Villeneuve circuit, the Sauber driver was fighting for position with Jarno Trulli when he touched the rear of his Toyota. The car lost control, lifted slightly off the ground, and this happened.
What an accident! Kubica has suffered a brutal crash. We saw how his head moved in that brutal impact.
Kubica crashed violently into the wall. The car bounced, crossed the track completely destroyed, and ended up rolling until it stopped against the barrier on the other side. For a few seconds, the scene was chilling. The single-seater was wrecked, the wheels had come off, and Kubica remained motionless inside the car. But, against all odds, his injuries were much less severe than everyone imagined. He suffered a mild concussion and a sprained ankle. Even so, the FIA did not allow him to race in the next United States Grand Prix as a precaution. However, years earlier, a race in Canada had already left another driver with far more serious consequences. But before we continue, if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe. We are already over 90,000 strong, so we are in the final stretch to reach the much-desired 100,000 subscribers. Subscribe, so join us and subscribe. Gerhard Berger experienced the most terrifying accident of his career during the 1989 San Marino Grand Prix. In the first laps of the race, Gerhard Berger was going at high speed in his Ferrari when he suffered a mechanical failure that caused him to lose control. The car went straight into the wall, and this happened. Subscribe! Subscribe! Ferrari crashed! Subscribe! It was immediately engulfed in flames. For several seconds, Berger was trapped inside the car while the marshals ran to put out the fire as quickly as possible. They managed to get him out alive, but unfortunately, he did not come out unscathed. Berger suffered burns on his hands, rib injuries, and lost consciousness. Burns on his hands, rib injuries, and he lost consciousness from the impact. The accident forced him to miss the next race in Monaco, and it left one of the most powerful images ever seen on the Italian circuit. Michael Schumacher suffered the most critical injury of his career during the 1999 British Grand Prix. On the first lap of the race, the German approached Stowe, but when he tried to brake, the car didn't respond, and then this happened. The Ferrari went straight on and crashed head-on into the tire barriers. And although at first the impact didn't look so chilling, the result was much more serious than it initially seemed. Schumacher suffered a fracture in his right leg, an injury that kept him out for several Grand Prix. And with that, he also said goodbye to the fight for the Drivers' Championship. And Ferrari had to continue the season without their main driver. He finally returned after 6 races at the Malaysian Grand Prix, where he took pole position and finished second. But by then, the accident had already completely changed his season. And although that comeback was spectacular, later on we'll see another driver who also managed to return, but after surviving a much worse accident. Olivier Panis suffered a life-changing injury during the 1997 Canadian Grand Prix. In the final laps of the race, the Frenchman was fighting to secure another great result with Prost, in a season where he had become one of the surprises of the championship. While passing through a fast section of the Gilles Villeneuve circuit, he lost control of the car. And then this happened. And a huge crash for Olivier Panis. Panis went straight into the barriers, hit the tire wall violently, and the front of the car was destroyed. Immediately, the doctors arrived and noticed that this was not just any crash. Panis suffered fractures in both legs, a brutal injury that kept him out for several Grand Prix races, and the crash came at the worst possible moment. Because up until then, Panis's career was on the rise and showed a lot of promise. but that accident suddenly cut his momentum. And although he returned to compete months later, he was never the same again. Luciano Burti suffered an accident that ended his career during the 2001 Belgian Grand Prix. At Spa-Francorchamps, he was fighting for position with Eddie Irvine when, upon reaching Blanchimont, the two cars made contact. Burti's Prost lost its front wing. He was left with almost no control, and this happened. Burti, Irvine. He can't stop it. The car went straight into the barriers and ended up buried in the tires. The impact was terrifying. For several seconds, the doctors and marshals worked around the car while Burti remained inside. Finally, he was removed from the car and taken to the hospital, where he was diagnosed with a severe concussion, head injuries, and facial injuries. And because of that, Burti did not race again for the rest of the season. In fact, that accident practically marked the end of Burti's career in the series. Felipe Massa suffered one of the strangest and most dangerous accidents in Formula One at the 2009 Hungarian Grand Prix. During qualifying, Massa was coming at high speed in his Ferrari when a spring that had come loose from Rubens Barrichello's car flew straight toward his helmet. The impact knocked him unconscious, and then this happened. The Ferrari kept going out of control and ended up crashing hard into the tire barriers. The crash against the wall was very hard, but the most serious thing had happened seconds before, because the worst blow was the spring hitting his head. After the accident, Massa was taken to the hospital, where it was confirmed that he had suffered a skull fracture and injuries near his left eye. The injury was so serious that he had to undergo emergency surgery and was out for the rest of the 2009 season. And although he returned to compete the following year, that spring was just centimeters away from changing his life forever. Rubens Barrichello suffered an accident that almost cost him his life during the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix. During Friday's qualifying, Barrichello lost control while going through a fast section of the circuit. The car hit the curb, was launched into the air, and this happened. The Jordan crashed violently into the tire barrier and ended up overturned. Barrichello was unconscious inside the car, while the doctors quickly arrived at the scene of the crash. However, the situation was even more serious than it seemed. Years later, the Brazilian said that he swallowed his tongue and stopped breathing for a few minutes. It was Sid Watkins, the Formula One doctor who managed to clear his airways and save his life. Afterward, Barrichello was unconscious and taken from the car to the medical center. There, the magnitude of the impact was confirmed. A broken nose, cuts in his mouth, bruised ribs, and temporary memory loss. Fortunately, he managed to recover, but he couldn't participate in Sunday's race. A race that would end up becoming one of the most tragic days in the history of Formula One. However, just 2 weeks later, another driver would suffer a crash. This time, it wouldn't end with a broken nose, but with something much worse. But before that, if you're enjoying this video, subscribe. Karl Wendlinger suffered a very serious accident that left him in a coma at the 1994 Monaco Grand Prix. During the first free practice, Wendlinger was driving his Sauber through the chicane area, one of the fastest parts of the circuit. When he reached the braking zone, he lost control and this happened. The car went straight into the barriers and hit the wall sideways. At first glance, it didn't seem like a serious accident. However, the outcome was very severe. Wendlinger suffered a severe head injury and had to be taken immediately to the hospital, where he fell into a coma. Finally, after 19 days, he managed to wake up. But although he survived, the accident completely changed his career. Wendlinger didn't race in Formula One for the rest of the season. and although he returned the following year, he was never the same again. Mika Häkkinen suffered an accident that almost cost him his life at the 1995 Australian Grand Prix. During qualifying, the Finn was driving his McLaren when he suffered a puncture in one of the fastest sections of the circuit. The car lost control, went straight into the barriers, and this happened. The impact was brutal. The car crashed hard against the tire wall and came to a stop in the runoff area. However, it quickly became clear that this was not a normal accident. Häkkinen stayed motionless in the car as doctors arrived and began treating him. The driver had suffered a severe head injury and a skull fracture. His condition was so delicate that the doctors had to perform an emergency tracheotomy to allow him to breathe. After being rescued, he was taken to the hospital in critical condition, where he spent several days in a very serious condition. Fortunately, Häkkinen survived again and months later returned to compete in Formula 1. But that accident came very close to forever changing the story of a driver who years later would end up becoming a world champion. Romain Grosjean suffered an accident that ended his Formula 1 career during the 2020 Bahrain Grand Prix. Grosjean was in the middle of the pack when he made contact with Daniil Kvyat's AlphaTauri. The Haas lost control. It went straight into the barriers, and this happened.
This is turn 4. He's already sliding along there, and there's a huge fire. Incredible what happened.
The impact was terrifying. The car went through the guardrail, split in two, and was engulfed in a huge ball of fire. For 28 seconds, Grosjean was trapped inside the car, surrounded by flames, while the medical car arrived at the scene. He finally managed to get out and jump over the barrier, but although he survived, he did not come out unscathed. Grosjean suffered burns on his hands and other parts of his body from being trapped in the flames for so long. The halo, the fireproof suit, and the quick reaction of the doctors saved his life. However, that accident marked the end of his Formula 1 career, and although his injuries were much less severe than they could have been, the next two cases were not so lucky. Because here we're not just talking about burns on the hands anymore, but about drivers who were scarred for life. Niki Lauda suffered one of the most chilling accidents in the history of Formula 1 during the 1976 German Grand Prix. Lauda was the reigning champion and the leader of the championship, but before the race, he had already warned that racing at Nürburgring under those conditions was too dangerous. Even so, the race went ahead. In the first laps, Lauda's Ferrari lost control, crashed into the barriers, bounced back onto the track, and that happened. The Ferrari was left stranded in the middle of the track, and seconds later it was hit by other cars. But the worst came immediately after. The car started to catch fire with Lauda trapped inside. For almost a minute, he was surrounded by fire and exposed to toxic smoke, while other drivers and marshals tried to get him out of the car. They finally managed to rescue him alive, but the consequences were terrible. Lauda suffered severe burns on his face and head, as well as lung injuries from inhaling toxic gases. His condition was so critical that he even received the last rites at the hospital. And even so, against all odds, he returned to compete just 6 weeks later at the Italian Grand Prix. But although the accident didn't take his life, it did leave him with physical scars that stayed with him forever. However, the first place on this list didn't need fire to become one of the most shocking images ever seen in the history of Formula 1. But before we continue, if you're enjoying this video and want more like it, subscribe. Martin Donnelly suffered one of the most brutal accidents in the history of Formula 1 during the 1990 Spanish Grand Prix. And unlike the rest of the accidents on this list, here there was no need to wait for the medical report to understand that something terrible had happened. The image said it all. During qualifying in Jerez, Donnelly was driving his Lotus when he lost control in one of the fast corners of the circuit. The car suddenly crashed into the barriers, and this happened. The impact was devastating. The Lotus was completely destroyed, the survival cell broke, and Donnelly ended up lying in the middle of the track, still strapped to the car seat. For several seconds, the scene was absolutely chilling. The doctors and marshals quickly arrived at the scene while the driver remained motionless on the asphalt. Donnelly suffered very serious injuries, fractures in both legs, internal damage, and bruises to his brain and arms. Fortunately, he managed to survive, but his career in Formula One ended at that very moment. Because that accident not only destroyed his car, but also the future of a driver who had great potential and so much to prove. And decades later, his story resurfaced in front of millions of people. Because Martin Donnelly's accident served as inspiration for part of the backstory of Sonny Hayes, the protagonist of the Formula One movie. A curious way to remember that, although Donnelly survived, that crash has always remained one of the most shocking images this sport has ever seen. However, although all the cases on this list resulted in brutal injuries, there was something they all had in common. They survived. But in Formula One, not everyone was that lucky. There were also crashes that ended in tragedies impossible to forget, because of human errors, negligence, or a combination of bad luck, speed, and decisions that should never have been made. So watch this video if you want to learn about the most tragic deaths in the history of Formula One.